When people think about France's role in the American Revolution, if they think about that at all, they likely conjure up an image of the bespectacled womanizer, printer, freedom fighter, and diplomat extraordinaire Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, after all, did play a central role in getting the French to support the American cause. Indeed, he did. But he was not the first ambassador of the United States to France. He was not the first patriot who waded through the clogged streets of Paris, obtaining the support of politicians and businessmen alike. That honor lies with one of Franklin's colleagues, the all-but-forgotten lawyer-turned-merchant-turned-politician-turned-diplomat, Silas Deane. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. Silas Deane was born to the blacksmith Silas Deane and his wife Hannah Barker on December 24, 1737, in the small oceanside town of Groton, Connecticut. He had 6 siblings. We know little about Silas's early childhood, but we can assume he, like any boy at that time, grew up helping his father with business and playing games with the other boys. The young Silas must have also had a good head on his shoulders because he obtained a full scholarship to attend Yale University, graduating in 1758. During the next few years, he worked as a schoolteacher while continuing his education, this time focusing on law. One of his pupils was the young Edward Bancroft, a man who would play a prominent role in Silas's later life. After passing the bar exam in 1761, he began practicing as a lawyer near Hartford, Connecticut. It turns out the life of a lawyer didn't suit young Silas. Less than a year later, he moved to Wethersfield, Connecticut, launching his career as a merchant. Shortly after arriving in Wethersfield, he used his legal education to help a Miss Webb, a wealthy merchant's widow, settle her husband's affairs. The two quickly developed feelings for one another, and Silas and Mehitabel were married in 1763. Silas inherited her late husband's assets as part of the marriage, helping grow his own business exponentially. The two would go on to have one child, Jesse, born in 1764. Their marriage, while a happy one, was short. Mehitabel passed away in 1767. After his wife's death, Silas became involved in politics, running and winning a seat in the Connecticut General Assembly in 1768. A year later, after the urging of several friends, he joined the Wethersfield Committee of Correspondence to enforce the community's non-importation policies. He would also, in 1769 or 1770, depending on which source you believe, marry yet another widow, Elizabeth Evarts. Elizabeth's family had extensive political connections. She was the granddaughter of former Governor Gurdon Saltonstall. Her political connections would serve Deane well as he continued his political rise. In no small part due to his wife's connections, when the First Continental Congress was called in 1774, Silas was appointed one of Connecticut's representatives. He would be reappointed when the Second Continental Congress convened in 1775. Silas, a vocal supporter of colonial independence, threw himself into the work. He served as a member of several committees overseeing the creation of the Continental Navy and playing a large part in procuring the arms and supplies that the Army needed to seize Fort Ticonderoga. In a letter to his wife, he bragged that, due to his exploits, he was nicknamed Ticonderoga by the other delegates. By all accounts, he was well liked with everyone he worked with. He did not, however, get along with the Connecticut State Assembly. The Assembly was displeased. Deane supported Israel Putnam for second-in-command of the Continental Army rather than their choice, Daniel Wooster. He was not appointed for a third term. Several of Deane's newfound political allies, namely Benjamin Franklin, Robert Morris, and John Jay, thought Deane was too valuable to lose through political machinations. Through their work on the Committee of Secret Correspondence, the committee handling foreign affairs, the men asked Silas to serve as a secret envoy to France. Silas accepted, though he wondered to his wife why he was chosen. He didn't speak French or have any previous diplomatic experience. By taking his post in January 1776, Deane, if unofficially, became the first diplomat of the yet-to-be-proclaimed United States. In France, Silas was ordered to transact such business, commercial and political, as we have committed to his care in behalf and by the authority of Congress of the 13 United Colonies. These vaguely worded instructions gave him plenty of wiggle room to act as an official, unofficial ambassador. Remember, the colonies had yet to declare independence. They were still legally part of the British Empire, and as such, the colonies didn't have official diplomats. France also couldn't, at least openly and legally, recognize that Deane was a diplomat. Deane arrived in France in mid-June, and by mid-July, he had already made his way to Paris. Officially, he was there as a commercial agent on behalf of the Continental Congress to purchase gifts for Native Americans. While this was undoubtedly one of the many tasks Congress assigned Deane, they gave him $200,000 in continental currency for this. It was still just a convenient cover. The day after arriving in Paris, Deane, following the advice of Benjamin Franklin, wrote to his former pupil, Edward Bancroft, who was residing in London, and requested him to join him in Paris. Bancroft accepted the invitation and provided Deane with valuable information about the mood of the British public. He quickly established formal, semi-formal, and informal relationships with some of the most influential politicians of the day, including the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, and prominent businessmen such as Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. His relationship with Beaumarchais proved especially lucrative. Beaumarchais acted as an intermediary and advocate for Silas in his efforts to smuggle arms and uniforms to the American colonies with the secret support of the French king, Louis XVI. The machinations of Beaumarchais and Deane saw more than 6 million livres worth of equipment sent to the Continental Army. This equipment would enable General Horatio Gates to soundly defeat General Burgoyne's army at Saratoga in October 1777. Additionally, Beaumarchais directed to Deane many foreign military officers who wanted to serve in the Continental Army, such as Tadeusz Kosciuszko and Baron von Steuben. Some of the officers sent by Deane were held in high esteem by Congress and played an essential part in securing American independence. However, some of the officers, such as Thomas Conway and Philippe du Coudray, were met with strong disapproval by both Washington and Congress. In the mind of Congress, Deane's perceived missteps, rather than his successes, would be remembered. During the summer, Silas tacitly supported a plot concocted by James Aitken, a criminal and pyrotechnic, to sabotage Royal Navy dockyards in Great Britain. While it's unknown how much support Deane gave Aitken, Aitken's attacks failed to do much significant damage, but did succeed in causing mass hysteria in both the British government and among the people, until his capture and subsequent execution on March 10, 1777. Deane continued to faithfully serve his cause. He made significant progress with the Comte de Vergennes, who agreed to send colonists if, of course, they declared their independence from Great Britain, 1 million livres to fund the Continental Army. This deal, however, came with a catch. The Comte wanted French officers to be commissioned into the Continental Army too. Silas, unable to receive clear instructions, reluctantly agreed to that demand, mainly to appease the Comte and the King. Many of these officers, though, would prove incredibly unpopular in the Continental Army, further eroding Congress's trust in Silas. Throughout his time in Paris, he was continuously hampered by abysmal communication with home. It took months for his letters to be received by Congress, and even longer for him to receive their reply. For example, he only received an official copy of the Declaration of Independence on November 16, 1776, despite Paris newspapers having reported on the declaration for over a month. Such long delays in communication were a major obstacle. Despite these immense challenges, Silas persevered and performed his duties with the utmost integrity. His tireless efforts and unwavering dedication to the American cause played a significant role in gaining French support. On top of that, Silas devoted much of his personal fortune to the cause. Unfortunately, his generosity would be repaid only by jealousy and accusations of corruption. On December 4th, 1776, everything would change for Silas Deane. Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee had arrived as the official envoys of France. Deane would serve alongside these two men, attempting to establish a formal alliance with the French. Despite their efforts, the French were hesitant to commit, as King Louis XVI and his ministers wanted to see if the American forces could stand up to the might of the British Empire. In March 1777, Franklin, the most seasoned diplomat of the three, offered Edward Bancroft, Deane's pupil, the position of Chief Secretary to the American Commission in Paris. Bancroft quickly accepted the post. What Franklin, Deane, or Lee did not know was that Bancroft had been quietly approached by William Eden, the chief of the British Secret Service, in February and asked to serve as a spy for the British. Bancroft agreed. Bancroft was deeply concerned about the coming war between Britain and the United States, and to end the bloodshed, clandestinely handed the British correspondence between the Commission and Congress, such as the Treaty of Alliance. Silas, sadly, would be betrayed not only by Bancroft, but by many other people as well. Throughout 1777, his fellow envoy, Arthur Lee, the youngest son of a powerful Virginia family, was jealous of the low-born Deane's rapid rise. Unbeknownst to Deane, Lee and his two brothers in Congress began accusing Deane of financial impropriety. The Lees claimed that Deane was charging the United States for military supplies that were intended as gifts from France and pocketing the money. While the Lees prepared their attack, Deane also suffered another personal tragedy. His wife, Elizabeth, died in late 1777. Congress, already upset about some of the foreign officers Deane had sent without their permission and alarmed by these accusations, recalled Deane in November 1777. However, Deane didn't receive the letter until March 4th, 1778. By that time, the news of the American victory at Saratoga had finally arrived in Paris, giving the American delegation the news they desperately needed to secure official French support. On February 6, 1778, Deane, Lee, and Franklin signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the Comte, formally establishing diplomatic and economic ties between France and the United States. At the same time, the parties also signed the secret Treaty of Alliance that forged a military alliance between France and the U.S. While the letter of recall arrived after these triumphs, it gave no reason. Deane thought Congress merely wanted a first-hand report on European affairs. He and Franklin thought he would be quickly returning to Paris. But when Deane arrived in Philadelphia on July 15, 1778, with the first French ambassador and a signed Treaty of Alliance in tow, he was aghast at these allegations of corruption. Unaware he would have to defend himself, he had left his account books in Paris. A bitter back and forth between Deane's critics, namely Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, and his supporters, John Jay and Robert Morris, dragged on for months. The Lee brothers and Deane attacked one another, not just before Congress, but also in the press. Deane asked permission to return to Paris to bring back his ledgers. Congress denied his request. Congress finally offered Deane $10,000 in devalued continental currency to reimburse his expenses. Deane declined, arguing that the amount was far too small. Congress finally allowed Deane, his reputation now shattered, to return to France in late 1780 to try and get his affairs in order. By this time, the once energetic and zealous patriot Deane was an embittered, depressed, and relatively destitute man. He had spent much of his own fortune procuring supplies. During his second stint in Paris, Deane wrote letters to friends expressing his distress at the divisions in Congress which had caused him so much suffering, and he came to believe the war was unwinnable. The British seized one of these letters and quickly printed it in New York City. Deane was now wrongfully seen by many as a traitor. Many people now believed Lee's unfounded accusations. Unwelcome back in America and unable to afford life in Paris, he moved to Ghent, where he would remain in a drink-induced stupor for the next few years. While he tried to get back into the merchant game, he was ultimately unsuccessful, and he lived off money provided to him by his old friends. In 1789, Deane, now living in England, finally wanted to return home. He sought to recover both his lost fortune and mend his shattered reputation. The last person who Deane visited with before he left for America was his old pupil, Edward Bancroft. It's unlikely Deane ever knew he was a spy for the British. Just after the ship that would take him back home disembarked, Deane suddenly fell violently ill and died on September 23, 1789, at the age of 51. Many people at the time attributed his death to natural causes. Others, like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, thought Deane committed suicide. More recently, however, the historian Julian Boyd introduced a new theory that suggests Bancroft, an educated chemist, may have poisoned his old teacher Silas out of fear that Silas had figured out he was a spy and was going to report it to Congress. Bancroft feared that if this information went public, he'd lose the pension the British had been giving him for being a spy. Bancroft would also write vociferously to many of the founding fathers that Deane died of suicide. He became uniquely passionate about spreading that version of events. We will likely never know for sure the true fate of Silas Deane. Silas's meteoric ascension from the son of a small-town blacksmith to a respected global diplomat is a powerful embodiment of the classic rags-to-riches tale that would later be known as the American Dream. His life also encapsulates the factionalism and political divides among the early founders. It also shows us that even people we declare to be great are prone still to jealousy, rage, and plotting, just like everyone else. His efforts in France marked America's introduction on the world stage as an independent nation, and his efforts in courting French political and business support for the American cause did play a vital role in the rebellion's eventual triumph, even if Benjamin Franklin got all the credit. His procurement of supplies, as well as the exceptional officers he dispatched to join the understaffed and underexperienced Continental Army, played an incalculable role in the eventual American victory. In the end, Silas Deane, like many others who came after him, dedicated their life to serving a cause and a nation they believed in, even if that nation later failed to recognize their services. I hope you found this video both informative and exciting. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment, and join us next time as we look at our next forgotten figure, one of the best battlefield tacticians on either side of the Revolution, Daniel Morgan.